Thank you very much. So who has autism? It's a simple question, right? Who has autism? Really, very good, you can answer it, and you may be the only one. Because the next thing I was going to say is only a person with autism really knows what it means to have autism. But how do we know who has autism in the first place? Now, we could talk about diagnostic criteria and the way the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention compiles the statistics of autism, and we will touch on these important things, but we need more context in answering the question of who has autism. Autism and autism spectrum disorder are labels. They're labels that help us try to understand how a person interacts and communicates and behaves and learns. And these are differences that are both unique and challenging. The lens we use to see those behaviors of an individual and the lens we use to describe these differences has a big impact on who has autism. There have been hints throughout history of autism, but we also need to know, when are we asking? Did autism not exist before Dr. Leo Kanner described the first 11 children with autism in 1943? Does Asperger's disorder no longer exist now that the diagnostic criteria have changed in the US? I think we would say no to those questions. But since the label of autism was first used, there have been two major periods. And we're going to take a little bit of a walk in history, and this may seem like a long way of talking about autism and prevalence and what's happening. But I think it's vital. Because first we've had a period that I'll call classic autism, from the 1940s through the 1970s. And this was a period of discovery, definition, and isolation. The second major period has been the emergence of the autism spectrum from the 1980s till now, still ongoing. This has been a time of expansion, of possibility, and of many questions. During this period, both of these periods, autism has changed for the individual and for the community, the family, and society. Through the lens of the classic period, we recognize autism as a unique condition for the first time, but with a much more narrow focus than we have today. In 1943, Dr. Kanner described 11 children with autistic disturbances of affective contact, shaping our view of autism and establishing in some ways the prototype of classic autism. He used the Greek word autism, meaning into the self. The first child he described, case number 1, was a boy named Donald T. Donald was 5 years old when Dr. Kanner saw him at Johns Hopkins, and Donald would walk around shaking his head and flapping his fingers, seemingly unaware of others. He wasn't really interested in other children, but he had an excellent memory for words, and he delighted in words like semicolon. He'd been described as hopelessly insane, and Dr. Kanner's description of Donald's condition as autism, having characteristics similar to other children that existed, was a big step forward. Each of the children that Kanner described had unusual ways of interacting, communicating, and behaving, and these became the core features for identifying autism. However, it was another 40 years until autism was recognized as a separate developmental condition. Instead, in these early years, autism was seen as a symptom of childhood schizophrenia, describing overt disconnect and withdrawal from other people. The label of autism meant extreme dysfunction. It meant the person was isolated, often either at home or removed to an institution with little family or community involvement. In many ways, autism was hidden. Donald T. was ordered to an institution at the age of 3. After a year, when he became totally withdrawn, his parents broke the norms and insisted that their little boy be able to come home. They lived in a small town, and they pushed him to learn basics, such as dressing himself, doing simple chores like watering the flowers, and even going to school. That was quite a feat for the time. In the 1960s, advocacy picked up with a push for research on biologic differences and on interventions. There was thought to be hope. We can do something. We can teach our individuals with autism. Parent and parent professional advocates dared to take charge of their children's future with a relentless belief in their ability to learn and their right to be members of the community. So, who had autism during the classic period? For many decades, the picture of autism was pretty consistent. Autism was considered very rare, estimated to occur in about 1 in 2,000 children, with 4 to 5 boys for every girl. Most people with autism, about 3 out of 4, also had intellectual disability or mental retardation. No one talked about adults with autism. People say if you meet one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Although there is great variability and complexity in the presentation of autism we recognize today, in many ways the core of who has autism has remained the same. In fact, all of the children described by Connor would very likely meet criteria for ASD today. At the same time, the lens through which we see autism has widened, and the meaning of autism has changed dramatically. In the past 20 to 30 years in particular, we've had a time of rapid evolution in our awareness, understanding, and conceptualization of autism. Many of you have been an integral part of that evolution. In 1980, the who of autism was redefined. For the first time, autism was included as its own diagnosis in the DSM. Pervasive developmental disorders became the umbrella term for autism, atypical autism, and PDD-NOS, opening the door to the autism spectrum. This change followed the landmark special education law and the start of residential deinstitutionalization, bringing about an important shift in the lives of people with autism and other disabilities, moving from living in isolation at home or in institutions to increasingly becoming part of neighborhood schools and communities. Also during this time, a new world of research was opening up. Research on genetics, brain functioning, nonverbal communication, and how people process social information. Enthusiasm for using visual supports and behavioral techniques blossomed. In the late 80s, the movie Rain Man helped bring a picture of classic autism into everyday conversation. Still, change was initially slow. In 1992, I went to the library to learn more about autism. Yahoo and Google didn't even exist yet. There were only 2 books on the shelf about autism. Both were published in 1967. Bruno Bettelheim's The Empty Fortress and Clara Claiborne Park's The Siege. I was horrified to think of a parent reading Bettelheim's book that blamed them for their autism. I checked out The Siege and was captivated by this mother's story and her efforts of trying to figure out how to teach her child how to interact and communicate and learn despite professional advice to give up. When I brought the book back to the library, I thought about tossing the Bettelheim book in the trash, but I couldn't do it. Instead, I wrote a note in the front of the book in true nerd fashion. It said, "For historical purposes only, do not take this as a guide for autism." There may be the Bettelheim book also in the Emory University Library that says that as well. I hope people would read The Siege instead. The daughter, Jessie Park, has grown up to work in the local university mailroom for over 30 years and to be quite an accomplished artist. Her mother has since passed away, but her efforts have lived on. Around the time of my library search in the early 90s, students with special needs could qualify for special education with a label of autism for the first time. Also, the earlier writings of Hans Asperger, an Austrian pediatrician, were becoming known. Asperger used the term autism to describe a group of children with unusual ways of interacting and behaving, much like Connor's kids, but with more developed language and intellectual skills. More like little professors, spouting facts and information regardless of the interest of those around them. Asperger's disorder was added to the diagnostic criteria in 1994, and estimates of how many people had autism started to change. up from 1 in 2,000 to 1 in 500. Despite these changes in the landscape of autism, in the mid-90s, we were still seeing children and adults with very classic autism in the diagnostic clinic where I worked. It was amazing to see an adult who now would be clearly recognized as having autism come in, and nobody had ever mentioned that word to their parent. In 1997, I was working with a county school system to develop an autism inclusion program. When we started, we had 5 students who were identified with autism. As word got out about help and support for autism, within 3 years, we had 125 students with autism. The lens in the community I was working and in many other communities began to change rapidly. Following in the footsteps of the early pioneering parents, a group of parents in Brick Township, New Jersey were concerned about a cluster of autism in their town. CDC worked with state and local community to do the first modern prevalence study of autism in the US. I was also eager to understand the changes I was seeing in my community and was thankful to be asked to be one of the clinicians to help define who has autism for this first BRIC study, as well as the ongoing CDC prevalence studies in multiple areas of the United States. From these early prevalence studies in the late 1990s, the best estimate was 6 per 1,000, or 1 in 166 children had an autism spectrum disorder, started to shift from autism to ASD. Similar estimates were found in other countries. Over the past decade, we have increasingly recognized the complexity of autism beyond the core symptoms, the importance of paying attention to the whole person, health and well-being, autism across the lifespan. We recognize that autism is not a distinctly separate condition, but a group of characteristics that present along a continuum, sometimes present in the extreme, resulting in significant disability and requiring 24/7 support, but sometimes present at mild levels, overlapping with other conditions, or being a characteristic or a variation of typical behavior. For some, these variations lead to important contributions through unique ways of seeing the world, as we've seen with Dr. Temple Grandin, who has taken her interest in animals as well as her own sensory experiences, and has become an inspiration for developing talents and skills of people with autism. We now hear from people with autism themselves who are engaged in self-advocacy, the experts of actual experience. Where we draw the line on this continuum as a society, autism as a disorder and autism as a characteristic, has a huge impact on who we count as having autism. CDC has continued to provide updated snapshots of the population of children with ASD in multiple areas of the US. CDC's prevalence estimates have changed from 1 in 150 in the years 2000 and 2002 to 1 in 88 in the year 2008, to the most recent estimate of 1 in 68 children. 1 in 68 children identified with an autism spectrum disorder. To everybody who is either that one child or who is the parent or family member or caregiver of that child, nothing matters more than that one. And from a population level, we've got to understand how we can use these data to better help that one. As much as things have changed, some things have also stayed the same. Our estimates are still 4 to 5 boys for every girl, although the picture looks different. Girls in the past were more likely to have intellectual disability, and now it's very similar to boys. We also see differences in identification by race and ethnicity, with white children being 30% more likely to be identified than black children and 50% more likely to be identified than Hispanic children. We have a lot of work to do to close what is probably a resource gap. Today, about 1 in 3 children with ASD have intellectual disability. Quite a different picture from 3 out of 4 with autism in the classic period. Some communities have found similar or even higher estimates of autism prevalence. Autism has become a global concern, but in many places, autism is still hidden. It is clear that more people are identified with autism today than ever before, and our picture of autism is still evolving. Prevalence studies, the kind that provide us counts of who has autism, describe the landscape using the lens we have at the time. They are limited in our ability to actually understand why is this happening. Certainly our expanded view of autism and who has autism has contributed to our increases. Our ability to access and share information has grown exponentially. At the same time, we can't ignore the in many ways that our society has changed that could contribute to the risk of autism. Advances in technology have helped babies stay alive and healthy who may not have survived in the past. For example, infants who are born very early or very small. More babies are increasingly born with help or to parents later in life. We are exposed to a more complex environment, and we are only just beginning to understand the complex interactions between biology and the environment. We need excellent science. We need excellent science to help with these answers, and the Autism Science Foundation is an important supporter of the cutting-edge science that we desperately need. We know there is no single explanation for increases in autism, but we also know that the impact on individuals and society is real. These increasing counts of who has autism must be taken as a serious call to help support those who are affected now. Last year, we saw another potentially big shift in our concept of autism with the DSM-5. No more PDD, no more subtypes, just one autism spectrum disorder. Still a categorical concept, either you have or you don't have ASD, but with an emphasis on describing the person's functioning in key areas. What type and level of support does the person need to communicate and to interact, to engage in meaningful and productive activities? There's been a lot of concern about the implication of these changes, and emerging research indicates that the core of autism remains unchanged. People with more classic autism are still clearly on the spectrum. For those who would meet the lower threshold conditions like Asperger and PDD-NOS, the picture is less clear. Hopefully, the changes will mean more clear diagnosis and lead to needed services and supports. Time will tell. In 2010, 2 reporters wondered what happened to autism's first child, Donald T. They found him living in the same small town his parents brought him back to when he was a child. He was in his late 70s, and Donald lived on his own in his family's house, and he could drive. He had his routines like playing golf and having lunch with his brother the same day every week. He was described as oddly distant, uninterested in conversation, and awkward in his movements. But Donald was not just autism's first child. He was a son, a brother, a cousin, a former classmate, a neighbor. He was a member of the community in the full sense, and he had lived a good, seemingly enjoyable life. He was not alone. So who has autism? When I was in elementary school, kids with autism were not seen in school. By the time I was in high school, the kids were in the same school, but they were isolated in a separate building. There were a few students who were unusual in the way they communicated and behaved, but they got by or excelled in academics. So they were either ignored, bullied, or celebrated depending on their unique talents. This was the same in college, including the student who prepared to meet new people by memorizing the entire student directory. When I told him my name, he immediately told me where I lived and my phone number in a loud and halting voice. After initially panicking and being worried for my safety, I quickly realized that this was an innocent attempt to make a connection with new people. A brilliant feat of memorization, but very poor social judgment. No one had ever heard of Asperger's at the time. Now it would be nearly impossible not to recognize him as an Aspie right away. Who has autism has and will continue to change for the individual, the family, community, and society. How will we see autism in 10 years? For the estimated 1 in 68 with autism today, there is hope. There is information, there are tools, and there is community. We have a lot of work to do to help each person with autism and those that surround them thrive in community. How will you be part of the journey of who has autism? Thank you.